In ancient Israel, the rules were clear, especially about things like consulting astrologers or soothsayers or mediums or witches or anybody who believed that they could predict the future either by means of the sky and the stars or reading animal entrails or other magical rites. The rules were clear. You were not to abide by including them in the people of God. In fact, they were so dangerous they were to be killed and put to death from the midst of the congregation of people. That much seemed absolutely clear from the Torah. No room for any of those kind of practices. So why, when the Messiah is born, does God seem to go out of the way to draw some astrologers to come worship the newborn Messiah? That curious story is where we're headed in this session of When God Breaks the Rules. So we've been seeing all throughout this series how God has a way over the course of the scriptures of taking existing rules that might well have had a good reason for coming into existence, even ones that God ostensibly gave, and then reserving the right to bend them or even break them for the sake of reaching out to other people, for the sake of compassion, for the sake of love, for the sake of God's own consistent character. We're going to see that again in spades as we take a turn that bridges the Old Testament into the New Testament here in this next session. We're going to take a look first at rules and commandments from the Torah, from the ancient foundational commandments of ancient Israel that took a hard line against the practice of astrology and mediums or consulting the dead or anybody who believed that they could hornswoggle the people, bamboozle the people into thinking they could communicate with the spirit world or predict the future. All those are meant to be forbidden, and it was seen as a dangerous practice to consult with folks who practiced witchcraft or consulted the dead or spirits or things like that, because in a deep sense it's sort of a refusal to accept there's some stuff we don't know, and let's not pretend that our lives are governed by the fates of the stars or the constellations or the sun and the moon. Of course, interestingly, thousands of years later, modern science will also remind us our lives are not controlled by the patterns of the stars or the planets or things like that after all. But in ancient Israel, all this was up for grabs, and ancient Israel had commandments. Don't consult mediums, astrologers, anybody who looks to the skies and the stars for signs, that headed down a dangerous path. In fact, folks who practiced any of those sorts of arts were labeled abominations in the book of the Torah, in the commandments that are associated with Moses. That's pretty strong language. They're abhorrent, they're abominations, right? Like, this is terrible. You should weed these people out and should not be a part of the community of God's people at all. No room for them at all. Abominable is a pretty strong word, right? And yet, you and I, every year at Christmas time, celebrate a story. In fact, we may well have little figurines we put under our Christmas trees or on our mantelpiece of a time God deliberately got a hold of astrologers through means of astrology to bring them to come to know the infant Messiah. We call them the Magi, the three wise men sometimes. And one of the difficulties for us in this story is that we're so used to just calling them the three Magi, the three wise men, or calling them the we three kings because of the way the song goes, that we forget that these guys are astrologers. They watch the skies and are more likely, instead of being kings or even just generic wise people in general, astrologers. They may well have been practitioners of Zoroastrianism who would have looked to the skies and believed that the stars and the constellations and the placement of the planets gave signs for events here on Earth. And God chooses to be willing to get through to them by means of a star in the sky, Matthew tells us. They see this star and they are convinced that the way to interpret it is a new king has been born in Judea, and so they go to Judea and eventually are directed to Bethlehem, where they find the Christ child and offer their gifts of, gold, frankincense, and myrrh, right? We know the story. Like I say, you probably have figurines for the Magi in your nativity set. But what I think is often missed, and what we have to wrestle with, at least in this Bible study, is that the rules say they shouldn't belong, right? God's own commandments say people who study the stars for meanings and people who try to find predicting events in astrology and things, those people are sorcerers and should be put to death. And here, in this story, Matthew, the gospel writer, says, I'm well aware of that. I know those commandments. And yet I'm telling you the story of a God who's gone to great lengths to put something in the sky that got a hold of these guys who were watching from a distance, who interpret it in their language, in their ways, and are led to come to know Christ. In other words, God doesn't make these astrologers stop being astrologers. God doesn't say, all right, as long as you repent of being astrologers, I'll let you come find the Christ child. It's exactly through the thing that makes them abominable that God gets a hold of them. How do you wrap your minds around that? I mean, like, there's still good rules why it's probably not smart to get all hung up on astrology, where there's probably lots of good reasons why I'm not spending my money going to psychics, right? There's lots of ways that can go sideways, and it's just dangerous a place to go, right? And yet, here's the story of God picking the very people who the rules say should not belong, exactly by means of the thing that is the reason they shouldn't belong, and bring them to come to know the Christ child. That says something about the character of God. And of course, Matthew, the gospel writer, is on to that. Exactly why he's giving us stories like this is to say that in Jesus, God is doing something to reach further out beyond. Matthew, who in some ways is most interested in writing the story of Jesus as the Jewish Messiah, trying to persuade why people of Israel and Israelite background should believe in Jesus, is also trying to say, but this new Jesus, this Messiah, is coming for everybody, and we're going to have to wrap our minds around that, including people that the rules told us were not eligible. Wrestling with that and asking, what does that mean for our lives of faith today? That's where our conversation is going to take us this week in When God Breaks the Rules. So we hope you'll join us. We gather around the table Thursdays at 1 o'clock here at Community of Christ, or you can catch up with these video sessions here as well. This week, taking a look at the story of the abominable Magi. See you then.